In the mountains, time flows differently. Every step can be your last, and nature never forgives even the smallest mistake. In October of 2022, 46 climbers set out on a training climb to Draupadi Ka Danda in India. It was supposed to be routine, the same practice that dozens of groups had completed before them. But this time, it ended in tragedy. When an avalanche roared down the slope, 29 people were gone in seconds. Young athletes, cadets, instructors. For some, it was their very first summit. For others, it became their last. This is a story about complacency, about a fatal chain of events, and about the price people pay when they make mistakes in the mountains. On the night of October 4th, 2022, a young Indian mountaineer named Ankush Sharma woke up high in the mountains to have a cup of hot tea. He was just 23 years old, camping near the peak of Draupadi Ka Danda, a mountain that rises 5,670 meters into the sky. Climbers often call it simply DKD too. Around it stand other legendary Himalayan peaks, the Sagar, Shivling, and Meru Peak. At that time, Ankush was taking part in a 28-day training course at the Nehru Institute of Mountaineering, one of the most respected climbing schools in India. But here, mountaineering isn't just about sport. For decades, it has been tied to national security. Since 1947, India has been in conflict with Pakistan. And even after a ceasefire was signed in 2003, the border has remained tense. Much of it runs through rugged high-altitude terrain. That's why military climbers and professional instructors are so important for the country. Even though the institute is under the Ministry of Defense, it doesn't train only soldiers. Many students come simply because they love the mountains. The government also heavily subsidizes the programs, making them affordable even for young people from modest families. For many, it's the only way to become guides, lead expeditions, and turn climbing into a profession. Since the 1980s, the Nehru Institute has used Draupadi Ka Danda as a training ground. Over the years, it earned a reputation as the practice mountain. Now, let's return to that morning. Around Ankush, other students were waking up. It was the day of the big climb. The wind was strong, and light snow drifted across the camp. One of the students, Savin, a dark-haired young man, decided to sleep for another hour instead of drinking tea. Years earlier, he had worked in marketing with a promising career and no free time. But in 2015, he walked away from it all to dedicate his life to the mountains. Also among the group was 28-year-old Deep Thakar, a climber with a short beard and glasses. His dream was to one day conquer Amadablam in Nepal. For him, DKD-2 was supposed to be his very first mountain above 5,000 meters. Around 3:30 in the morning, the sky above the mountains finally cleared. From Camp 1, standing at 4,800 meters, the group set out into the darkness. 7 instructors led 30, 4 students, 3 porters, and a medic who worked for the institute. Not far behind them followed another man, a lone climber who wasn't part of the team. His goal was different, to reach the summit and then ski back down. Soon the group reached their first landmark, a rocky formation called Rambo Rock, sitting at 5,100 meters. There, they crossed a short but rugged stretch of terrain. Draupadi Ka Danda was not considered a difficult mountain. That's exactly why the Institute had chosen it for training climbs. For many of the students, this felt less like a dangerous challenge and more like an exciting adventure. In the middle of the long line of climbers walked Vani. Beams of headlamps cut through the darkness, sliding across the snow. Step by step, they carefully avoided small cracks in the glacier, making their way higher into the night. Soon, the sky began to brighten. At the front of the line, the strongest climbers broke trail, stepping through snow that reached up to their shins. As they approached the final stretch, the route climbed straight up a steep, narrow gully. The summit was now within sight. A few instructors and stronger students had almost reached it, fixing ropes to help those who were moving more slowly. All 46 climbers were now spread across the slope. Almost every one of them clipped to the safety line. They stood in a long column, waiting their turn to move. Orange helmets dotted the snow, and their jackets shone in bright shades of red, blue, and yellow. Vani tried to calm himself with a simple thought. Since 1981, the Institute had brought students here, and never once had there been a fatal accident. At 8:30 that morning, Ankush Sharma finally reached the top of the snowfield and unclipped from the fixed rope. Suddenly, there was a sharp crack like someone stepping on a dry branch. He turned his head and saw the entire mountainside begin to move. A massive avalanche was breaking loose. Tons of snow and blocks of ice came crashing down, sweeping climbers away. The wave of snow grew faster and faster, grinding everything in its path. One man, standing higher up, lost his footing and fell straight onto Vani. In desperation, he slammed his ice axe into the snow, hoping to stop the fall. As they slid together, he struggled to keep his head above the rushing snow, but the weight kept pulling him under. Sharma stood frozen, eyes wide, watching the nightmare unfold. The fixed rope had vanished. So had all of his friends. And strangely, there were no screams, no roar of the avalanche. It all seemed to happen in silence. When the snow finally settled, a few voices whispered prayers. But one by one, those voices went silent. At the fracture line, only Sharma and a handful of instructors were left standing. 30, for climbers had been swept away. But they weren't just dragged down the slope, they were hurled into a deep crevasse at 5,500 meters. They fell 80 feet into the darkness, crashing on top of each other with the snow and ice. Bodies were broken, bones were shattered, and inside that freezing crevasse, the wet snow hardened like concrete, trapping them where they lay. When Deep Thakar fell into the crevasse, for a moment he thought he was dropping into endless darkness. He landed on his stomach, and by sheer luck, part of his nose and mouth stayed above the shattered ice. It was just enough for him to breathe. He prayed that the snow would stop falling from above. But soon, another trainee crashed down on top of him. The man's crampons tore into Thakar's lips. That climber was suffocating, buried under the snow. And when he stopped moving, Thakar began to scream for help. Nearby, another climber, Alvi, was also trapped inside the crevasse. He twisted his head side to side, trying desperately to carve out a small pocket of air. His body was completely buried. Only a thin layer of snow covered his face, and somehow, he could still breathe. Another student, 20, old Surat Sikh, had blacked out during the fall. When he regained consciousness, he was terrified and disoriented. Opening his eyes, he saw a faint glimmer of light. His head was above the snow, but his body was completely entombed. One thought consumed him, his daughter. How will she survive without me? Who will take care of her? News of the avalanche quickly reached the head of the institute, stationed at Camp 1, 700 meters below. He rushed down to base camp and immediately began organizing a rescue. But as I mentioned before, DKD-2 was considered safe. It had the reputation of being avalanche-free. That's why it was chosen for student training. No one had ever imagined that something like this could happen. A dozen instructors and students who hadn't been swept away ran to the edge of the crevasse. One of them shouted, calling for his friends. When no voice came back, he broke down in tears. Instructor Anil Kumar spotted a few heads poking through the snow. But beyond that, there was nothing else to see. A few students rappelled about 15 meters down into the icy crevasse. They reached the top of a massive pile of snow and ice and began searching desperately for survivors. Ankush Sharma stayed at the edge, together with several other climbers. Their job was to set up a system to haul the injured back to safety. Deep down, he knew another avalanche could strike at any moment. Meanwhile, Ulfa was still almost completely buried under the snow. He couldn't move a muscle. The cold was so intense, it felt as if his left arm had turned to wood. At least 30 minutes passed before one of the instructors finally reached him. He dug out Ulfa's head and brushed the frozen snow off his glasses. "Don't worry, you're alive. We'll get you out of here," the instructor said calmly. The rescue team kept searching inside the crevasse, hoping to find more survivors. One of the first they pulled out was a lone skier named Jerry, the only one who didn't belong to the Institute's group. He had joined them during the climb. When they dug him out, he was almost unharmed. Instead of going back up, Jerry refused and stayed to help save others. Soon, he noticed a pair of green fluorescent boots sticking out of the snow. He recognized them immediately. They belonged to one of the instructors. Jerry started digging at that spot. He remembered those unusual boots were worn by Nami Rawat. At last, he uncovered her body. But Rawat was no longer breathing. A medic tried CPR, but there was nothing more they could do. Not long after, they found another instructor ready. She was lying with her hands clasped around her mouth, trying to create a pocket of air. But she had been buried too long. She too was gone. Meanwhile, Ankush Sharma stood at the edge of the crevasse, completely drained. He felt so weak it seemed like he might collapse. Still, he kept working, helping to pull others out. Nearly 3 hours after the avalanche, rescuers finally brought up Deep Thakar. He was so frozen he could no longer feel his body. "I don't have a leg. I can't stand," he screamed in panic. His face was covered with scratches, left by the suffocating climber who had fallen on top of him. Someone threw a jacket over him and laid him on the snow, next to 4 others. When Thakar turned his head and looked at them, he realized they were already dead. The rescue was painfully slow. The climbers had no avalanche shovels, no probes, no proper gear. They were digging with helmets and with Jerry's skis. Out of the 30, 4 climbers swallowed by the avalanche, only 5 survived. Just minutes after the avalanche, course instructor Shah Khan was guiding a student back to base camp when he spotted a porter running past, carrying a stretcher. That was the first sign that something terrible had happened. When Khan learned of the disaster, he rushed uphill. He switched on his radio and spoke to his colleagues. "We're coming. Don't give up. Hold on to hope." From base camp, they had to climb several hundred vertical meters. They pushed upward as fast as they could. But the closer they came, the more grim the messages over the radio became. Confirmed death, another one, and another. Confirmed death, another one, and another. Maybe it was naive, maybe even foolish, Khan later wrote in his blog. But I truly hoped there would be at least some chance for a helicopter, the way it happens in Nepal or in Europe. But no helicopters ever came. Instead, the instructors and students did everything they could, almost with bare hands. Help never arrived in time, and the storm that followed right after the avalanche erased all hope of a landing. At last, rescuers had no choice but to begin pulling out bodies. 28-year-old student Kachin Singh, in despair, ripped off his helmet and threw it to the ground. Later, he admitted that in that moment, he felt he should have died alongside his friends. Over the next few days, rescuers pulled 7 bodies from the crevasse, 5 trainees and 2 instructors. But the remains of 47-year-old Colonel Deepak Vashishta and 29-year-old sailor Vinay Panwar were never found. Their bodies were left forever on the mountain. Panwar was supposed to be married that very year. Khan reached the camp at about 1:30 in the afternoon, nearly 4 hours after first hearing of the avalanche. Around the same time, exhausted and shaken trainees and instructors began descending from the disaster site. One climber later recalled, even hardened military instructors, men who had seen battlefields and war, were crying like children. Khan said they watched their students die right in front of them, and they did everything they could. When they returned with most of the survivors, the rescuers were filled with frustration and anger, knowing they couldn't save everyone. Yet despite the losses, those who lived had done everything humanly possible. But there were so few left after the avalanche. Sharma, who had grown close to Khan through their shared love of long-distance running, saw him and broke down in tears. Khan embraced him. At that moment, another rescuer arrived, shouting, "We couldn't save them. They died before our eyes." They were so young, almost children. Climber Hanshaw remembered that one of the instructors was so overwhelmed, he couldn't speak a single word. By 9 that evening, the group finally reached base camp. The weather had turned even worse. Heavy rain poured down, and lightning split the sky. No one could remember ever seeing such a dark night on that mountain. The avalanche on DKD, 2 claimed 29 lives. The victims ranged in age from 18 to 47. Among them were promising athletes, soldiers, fathers, and the only breadwinners in their families. Two women were also lost, Nva and Rawat. The only ones who survived were those whose heads remained above the snow when they were thrown into the crevasse. After the tragedy, some local media pointed out just how unusual this disaster was. The slope where it happened was considered safe, not prone to avalanches at all. In the history of mountaineering, only one avalanche had taken more lives. Back in 1990, on Lennon Peak, an earthquake triggered an avalanche that killed 43 people. But that is a story for another time. Unlike the tragedy on Lennon Peak or the avalanche at Everest Base Camp in 2015 that claimed 18 lives, this one was not caused by an earthquake. Most likely, it was the result of human error. Fresh snow had fallen overnight. It hadn't bonded with the older layer beneath. Yet instructors believed the mountain was safe. For over 40 years, there had not been a single fatal accident here. They underestimated the danger and led the large group in a tight line without keeping distance. Under their combined weight, a section of the slope broke loose. That break triggered the avalanche. The lack of avalanche gear only made things worse. If the group had carried probes and shovels, many more lives might have been saved. The Indian authorities never released a detailed official report. They simply labeled the avalanche a natural disaster. But soon, a wave of criticism followed. Many argued this was not an act of nature, but the result of negligence. Most of the climbers, the leadership of the Nehru Institute, and the officials in charge refused to comment. The reason was clear: they were all active military personnel. And because of that, a deeper investigation was nearly impossible. After the tragedy, the Institute made significant changes to its training program. Now, every student is equipped with avalanche beacons and shovels, and each climb is accompanied by a dedicated rescue team. To be honest, the real cause of the disaster was the loss of vigilance among the instructors. For decades, they had led students up this mountain, convinced it was completely safe. In 40 years, there had not been a single serious accident. They began to feel at home on those slopes. They let their guard down. And in doing so, they overlooked critical details that ultimately led to catastrophe. Another crucial factor was the way the avalanche struck. It hurled the climbers straight into a deep crevasse. Had they only been swept down the slope, many more of them might have survived. This tragedy has left a permanent mark on the history of mountaineering. But what do you think about this disaster? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and hit the bell icon so you'll be the first to see new videos. Your support helps us continue telling these stories.